In April 2014, Ukraine was a powder keg of political turmoil. Just after the Euromaidan revolution and Crimea's annexation, pro-Russian protests erupted in cities like Donetsk and Luhansk. On April 7th, separatists declared the Donetsk People's Republic, igniting a fierce struggle for autonomy. By April 12th, armed groups, led by former Russian officer Igor Girkin, seized Sloviansk, marking the start of open conflict. The Ukrainian government responded with an anti-terrorism operation, but faced fierce resistance, fueled by Russian support. This chaotic month set the stage for a brutal conflict that reshaped the region and strained East-West relations for years to come. May 2014 was a pivotal moment in the Donbass War. Pro-Russian separatists held controversial referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk, claiming over 90% support for independence, despite widespread international condemnation. This bold move led to the declaration of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Meanwhile, Ukraine held presidential elections, with Petro Poroshenko promising to restore order, but the conflict only intensified. Clashes erupted in Donetsk, and strategic cities like Mariupol and Sloviansk became battlegrounds. The humanitarian crisis deepened as thousands fled the violence, marking May as a turning point that would shape the future of Ukraine and the region. June 2014 was a turning point in the Donbass conflict. Ukrainian forces ramped up their military operations, aiming to reclaim towns like Lyman from separatist control. The battle for Sloviansk became fierce, with heavy shelling and intense fighting marking the city as a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, accusations flew between Ukraine and Russia, with Kyiv claiming Moscow was fueling the insurgency. President Poroshenko's attempt at a ceasefire on June 20th was met with skepticism, and by the end of the month, hostilities resumed with even greater intensity. This month not only escalated the conflict, but also deepened the humanitarian crisis, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle in eastern Ukraine.
July 2014 was a turning point in the Donbass War. On the 5th, Ukrainian forces reclaimed Sloviansk, a crucial stronghold for separatists, forcing their leader, Igor Girkin, to retreat to Donetsk. The battle intensified as Ukraine aimed for Donetsk and Luhansk, leading to devastating urban clashes. Then, on July 17th, tragedy struck when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down, killing all 298 aboard. This shocking event galvanized international outrage and led to severe sanctions against Russia, deepening the geopolitical crisis. By the end of the month, the humanitarian situation was dire, with civilians suffering amidst relentless fighting. July 2014 marked a dramatic escalation, setting the stage for a prolonged conflict with far-reaching implications. August 2014 was a turning point in the Donbass War. Ukrainian forces ramped up their offensive, aiming to reclaim separatist-held territories, but faced fierce resistance. The battle for Luhansk intensified, leading to a dire humanitarian crisis. Then, on Ukraine's Independence Day, Russia crossed the border, directly supporting the separatists. This intervention shifted the balance, allowing them to launch a counteroffensive. The Battle of Ilovaisk became a tragic highlight, with Ukrainian troops surrounded and suffering devastating losses. This month not only escalated the conflict but also deepened the humanitarian crisis, marking a dark chapter in Ukraine's struggle.
September 2014 was a pivotal month in the Donbass War. As clashes continued, the conflict reached a stalemate, with Ukrainian forces struggling to hold their ground after heavy losses in August. The signing of the Minsk Agreement on September 5th aimed for peace, calling for a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops. Yet, violations erupted almost immediately, with fierce fighting around strategic locations like Donetsk Airport and the critical port city of Mariupol. The humanitarian crisis deepened, displacing thousands and leaving civilians in dire conditions. This month highlighted the complexities of war, where hopes for peace clashed with harsh realities on the ground. In late 2014, the Donbass War was a tense battlefield of intermittent clashes and fragile ceasefires. Despite the Minsk Agreement, fighting raged on, especially around Donetsk airport, a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Pro-Russian separatists held controversial elections in November, deepening political divides and isolating their regions. The international community condemned these elections, yet Russia offered tacit support, escalating tensions further. By December, a military stalemate emerged, with both sides digging in, while civilians faced a worsening humanitarian crisis. Access to basic services dwindled, and despite diplomatic efforts, peace felt elusive, marking a painful chapter in Ukraine's struggle for stability.
Between January and June 2015, the Donbass War escalated dramatically. Despite the Minsk agreements, fighting reignited, with Donetsk International Airport becoming a battleground. Pro-Russian separatists captured it in mid-January, a major setback for Ukraine. The brutal battle for Debaltseve followed, where Ukrainian forces, encircled, were forced to retreat on February 18th. This defeat solidified separatist control and highlighted the fragile ceasefire from the Minsk II agreements. As fighting waned, the humanitarian crisis deepened, with communities lacking basic necessities. By mid-2015, a tense stalemate emerged, with neither side gaining ground, while international sanctions against Russia failed to shift the conflict's trajectory. The scars of war ran deep, leaving the region in turmoil. Between June and December 2015, the Donbass War was a tense standoff. Despite a fragile ceasefire from the Minsk II agreements, clashes erupted frequently, especially around Donetsk and Mariupol. By September, a new truce offered a glimmer of hope, but political tensions escalated as separatists planned local elections, defying Ukrainian authority. This standoff kept the region on edge, with humanitarian conditions worsening. Civilians faced dire shortages of food and healthcare, trapped in a conflict that seemed endless. The situation was a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be in the face of deep-rooted tensions.
Between January and June 2016, the conflict in Donbass was a tense stalemate. Sporadic clashes erupted despite a fragile ceasefire, with both sides frequently violating the Minsk II agreements. The situation was particularly dire around Donetsk and Avdiivka, where artillery fire caused military and civilian casualties. Diplomatic efforts faltered as Ukraine insisted on regaining border control before any elections, while separatists demanded autonomy without Ukrainian troops. By April, clashes intensified, worsening the humanitarian crisis. Infrastructure crumbled, leaving communities without basic services. The international community pressured Russia to withdraw support for separatists, but tensions only escalated, leaving the people of Donbass trapped in a cycle of conflict and suffering. Between June and December 2016, the Donbass War dragged on in a frustrating stalemate. Ceasefire violations were rampant, especially in Donetsk and Luhansk, where both sides blamed each other for artillery attacks. Despite the Minsk II agreements, political negotiations were deadlocked. Ukraine insisted on regaining control of its border first, while separatists demanded autonomy. Meanwhile, civilians faced dire living conditions, struggling for food, water, and healthcare amid a humanitarian crisis. The region was heavily militarized, with mines making many areas inaccessible. The conflict continued to devastate lives, with no end in sight. In early 2017, despite the Minsk II Accords, ceasefire violations surged in Donbass, especially around Donetsk and Avdiivka. Fighting intensified, with heavy artillery wreaking havoc on civilian life. Thousands in Avdiivka faced brutal winter conditions, trapped without heating or clean water. As spring rolled in, the conflict hit a stalemate, with both sides digging in, while political negotiations stalled. Humanitarian conditions worsened. People struggled for basic necessities, and aid groups faced immense challenges getting help to those in need. Meanwhile, international tensions flared, with sanctions against Russia failing to shift its stance. The war became a grim symbol of the broader East-West divide, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire with no end in sight. Between June and December 2017, the Donbass War was a grim stalemate. Clashes erupted around Avdiivka and Mariupol, despite fragile ceasefires. Civilians suffered as infrastructure crumbled, leaving many without electricity or clean water. Diplomatic talks stalled, with Ukraine demanding border control while separatists pushed for autonomy. The humanitarian crisis deepened as aid struggled to reach those in need. Sanctions against Russia remained, but geopolitical tensions only escalated. The conflict, though less visible, continued to wreak havoc, trapping civilians in a cycle of violence and despair. Between January and June 2019, the Donbass War was stuck in a frustrating stalemate. Ceasefire violations were rampant, with both Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists trading accusations while civilians suffered the consequences. The humanitarian crisis deepened as infrastructure crumbled, leaving communities without basic services. The election of Volodymyr Zelensky sparked hope for peace, but despite his calls for dialogue, real progress remained elusive. Tensions between Russia and the West only added to the complexity, making a resolution seem further away than ever. The conflict continued to grip the region, with no clear end in sight.
Between June and December 2018, the Donbass War was a tense stalemate. Ceasefire violations plagued the region, with clashes erupting almost daily. Diplomatic efforts seemed futile as tensions escalated, particularly from September onward. The humanitarian crisis deepened, leaving civilians in dire conditions. International pressure mounted, yet Russia's involvement complicated any potential resolution. This period highlighted the tragic consequences of conflict, with lives caught in the crossfire and hope for peace slipping further away. Between June and December 2019, the Donbass War remained in a frustrating stalemate. While clashes between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists decreased in intensity, ceasefire violations persisted, leaving communities near the front lines in dire straits. The December Normandy meeting brought hope, with Zelensky and Putin discussing a new ceasefire and a significant prisoner exchange. Yet, key issues like local elections and border control remained unresolved. Civilians faced a harsh humanitarian crisis, struggling with limited access to essential services. The geopolitical tensions only added to the complexity, keeping the path to peace obscured. Between January and June 2020, the Donbass War was stuck in a frustrating stalemate. Ceasefire violations were rampant, with both Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists trading blame for ongoing clashes. The humanitarian crisis deepened as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, complicating already dire living conditions. Quarantine measures restricted movement, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach those in need. Despite some diplomatic efforts, like a new ceasefire agreement in June, real progress remained elusive. The geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West only added to the complexity, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire with little hope for a peaceful resolution. Between June and December 2020, the war in Donbass was stuck in a frustrating stalemate. A fragile ceasefire, brokered by the OSCE, brought a brief reduction in violence, but clashes still erupted, especially around Donetsk and Luhansk. The humanitarian crisis deepened, worsened by COVID-19, leaving many without basic services as winter approached. Diplomatic efforts stalled, with the West pressing Russia to withdraw support for separatists, yet tensions remained high. As the year ended, hope for peace felt distant, with unresolved political issues and a weary population caught in the crossfire.
Between January and June 2021, the war in Donbass was a tense stalemate. Ceasefire violations were rampant, with sporadic clashes causing both military and civilian casualties. The OSCE reported a rise in violence, especially around Avdiivka and Halyuka. Then came Russia's massive troop mobilization near Ukraine's border, raising alarms of a potential invasion. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis deepened, worsened by COVID-19, leaving communities struggling for basic needs. Diplomatic talks remained stalled, with key issues unresolved and international tensions simmering. The situation was critical, with no clear path to peace in sight. Between June and December 2021, the Donbass War was stuck in a frustrating stalemate. Ceasefire violations surged, especially around Donetsk and Luhansk, with both sides trading accusations. Meanwhile, Russia amassed tens of thousands of troops near Ukraine, sparking international alarm and fears of invasion. Humanitarian conditions worsened, with civilians facing dire shortages of water and medical care, all while the pandemic complicated aid efforts. The geopolitical tension was palpable as Western nations pushed for Ukraine's sovereignty, but the path to peace remained elusive amidst rising chaos. Between January and June 2022, the war in Donbass transformed dramatically. Tensions soared as Russia amassed troops along Ukraine's border, and diplomatic talks crumbled. On February 21st, Russia recognized the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, setting the stage for invasion. Just days later, on February 24th, a full-scale assault began, targeting not just Donbass but the entire country. The fighting was brutal, especially in cities like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, where Ukrainian forces fiercely resisted. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with thousands dead and millions displaced, as infrastructure crumbled under relentless bombardment. Donbass became a battleground, marking a pivotal moment in this ongoing conflict. Between June and December 2022, the war in Donbass escalated dramatically. Intense fighting erupted as Russia aimed to tighten its grip on Donetsk and Luhansk, while Ukraine launched fierce counteroffensives. The capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk marked a grim chapter, but Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kharkiv shifted the tide. As winter set in, the conflict morphed into a brutal war of attrition, leaving widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure. Millions faced a dire humanitarian crisis, struggling without essential services or access to aid. The situation was volatile, with heavy casualties and a profound impact on countless lives. Between January and June 2023, the war in Donbass intensified dramatically. Bakhmut became a brutal battleground, symbolizing Ukrainian resilience amid relentless Russian assaults. As spring arrived, Ukraine launched counteroffensives, bolstered by Western military support, targeting key areas like Avdiivka and Mariinka. Despite slow progress against heavy defenses, they achieved local victories. By June, Ukraine escalated its efforts, employing guerrilla tactics to disrupt Russian supply lines. Yet, the humanitarian crisis deepened, with civilians suffering from constant shelling and displacement. The conflict raged on, leaving little hope for peace in sight.
Between June and December 2023, the war in Donbass intensified dramatically. Ukraine launched counteroffensives, aiming to reclaim territories in Donetsk and Luhansk, but faced fierce resistance from Russian troops. The fighting around Bakhmut and Avdiivka was relentless, with heavy artillery and drone strikes causing devastation. As winter set in, both sides found themselves in a brutal war of attrition, suffering heavy casualties and leaving civilians trapped in a humanitarian crisis. Essential services like water and electricity were disrupted, making survival increasingly difficult. The conflict, locked in a stalemate, showed little sign of resolution, leaving a grim reality for those caught in the crossfire.
In 2024, the war in Donbass raged on, a brutal clash between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Mariinka became battlegrounds, where fierce fighting led to heavy losses on both sides. Ukraine, armed with Western support, aimed to disrupt Russian supply lines, but faced relentless artillery and drone strikes. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with millions displaced and struggling for basic needs. Diplomatic efforts stalled, as Ukraine demanded sovereignty while Russia sought recognition for its self-proclaimed republics. The conflict remained a painful stalemate with no end in sight.